Before sunrise, wicks, wax, and the smell of sheep fat in the faint pre-dawn glow of ancient Rome. Long before the markets opened or the household slave stirred, the candle maker, known as a candlelight fabricator, was already awake. If you had wandered into the Subura district in the early 2nd century CE, you might have passed a nondescript wooden workshop tucked between a baker's kiln and a laundress's hut. It would have smelled vaguely of smoke, honey, sheep tallow, and something unmistakably acidic. The telltale trace of vinegar, soaked hemp wicks drying on lines overhead. You might picture a candle maker's job as simple, perhaps even quiet. And, in some ways it was. But it was also precise, time-consuming, and surprisingly dirty. Especially before the sun came up, our candle maker today, let's call him Gaius Fulvius Secundus, was not from a prestigious family, nor was he likely to appear in the annals of history. But in his own way, he kept Rome burning, his candles lit. Temple altars, tavern cellars, street vendor carts, and the dark corners of tenement stairwells. And although oil lamps were more common among the wealthy, the average plebeian or tradesman still relied heavily on candles, particularly those who couldn't afford a steady supply of olive oil. By the time Gaius pulled on his woolen tunic, already stiffened by beeswax, and tied his belt, the fire in the hearth had been lit. He stirred the coals with practiced familiarity and dropped in a broken amphora handle to fuel the flame. Scraps of pottery and cracked tiles were commonly used to stoke fires in poor households. Wood was expensive, and any wax scrap had to be saved for product, not fuel, from a corner basket. He withdrew yesterday's batch of hemp twine that had soaked overnight in salt water and vinegar. The acidity strengthened the fibers, helping them burn longer and straighter. He hung the strings to dry above the hearth, their wet fibers releasing a musty, herbal steam as they curled and stiffened in the warmth. In the workshop's dim light, one could see the evidence of years of wax boiling, soot-blackened ceiling beams, congealed globs of old tallow hardening in corners, and half-burned candles returned by unsatisfied customers. A broken table leaned against the far wall, covered in beeswax molds, wooden impressions shaped like small animals, household gods, or cornucopias. These were votive candles sold near temples or to devout housewives who lit them before small household shrines known as lararia. The wax itself came from several sources. Gaius preferred beeswax. It burned brighter and with a sweeter scent, but it was expensive and often reserved for wealthier clients. The bulk of his product came from tallow, rendered from sheep fat, sometimes goat. In lean months, he even bought pig fat from the market scraps, though it gave off a greasy, unpleasant smoke that clung to walls and lungs. Rendering the fat was no one's favorite part. Boiling it down produced a bubbling stew of foam, scum, and a meaty odor that hung in the nostrils for hours. But Gaius knew the timing well. You had to remove the fat from the heat at just the right moment to avoid spoiling its consistency. If it burned or smoked too much, the resulting candle would crumble, bend, or sputter in a draft. As the fat simmered, Gaius prepared his molds. Simple wooden troughs, really, coated with a dusting of ash to prevent sticking. Each wick was cut to size and centered with a thin wooden stick, carefully balanced so that it didn't lean left or right. A single off-center wick meant an uneven burn, which often led to candle collapse halfway through use. Candle making was an art, though few acknowledged it as such. By the time the sun rose above the rooftops, the first candles were already cooling on the shelves, some stubby and utilitarian, others shaped into the tiny bust of Jupiter or a curled dog for a child's birthday. A few small ones, no larger than a thimble, were destined for a fortune teller's stall by the market gates. These were dipped in lavender oil and rolled in ash, burned during rituals or divination sessions for those who sought visions or healing. Gaius wiped his brow with a cloth that had once been white but was now permanently stained wax yellow. He moved slowly, with care, each movement practiced but not hurried. Even as Rome stirred outside, with the clang of bread ovens and the lowing of oxen pulling carts. His work remained private and steady. His neighbors may have rushed through their mornings, but not Gaius. The wax did not hurry. And neither did he. One by one, he wrapped finished candles in coarse linen scraps, usually reused tunic sleeves or toga edges too frayed to mend. He tied each with twine and set them in a woven basket for delivery. Some were for a tavern near the circus grounds, others for a midwife who needed gentle light during late-night labors. A special order, a dozen sweet-smelling beeswax tapers, was bound for the villa of a minor senator's household. Gaius had wrapped those with more care than usual. Outside, the sun had climbed above the eastern wall, casting long shadows into the narrow alley. Gaius set his baskets by the door and leaned against the post, sipping from a clay cup filled with barley water. His hand smelled faintly of sheep and lavender. You might think the life of a Roman candle maker was repetitive, even dull. In many ways it was. But in each candle lay a trace of its maker, a small glow, a softened shadow, a quiet moment in the chaos of a bustling empire. And yet, Gaius had not yet faced the busiest part of his day. The temple orders, the stall disputes, the accidental wax fire that would break out later that afternoon, and the unexpected visit from a Praetorian guard who claimed one of Gaius's temple candles burned too. Fast and nearly caused a scandal, but those were matters for later. For now the candles cooled, and the city warmed, and so we must ask, what role did a humble craftsman like Gaius truly play in a world built on empires, armies, and emperor? Midday, temples, tensions, and a trip to the Forum. By midday, the Roman streets were well awake and alive with noise, but Gaius Fulvius Secundus was not swept up in the commotion. He stood in the narrow corridor between his workshop and the laundress's hut, adjusting the woven strap over his shoulder. His basket, filled with carefully wrapped candles, was heavier than usual today, a sign of growing demand. Religion, superstition, and poor street lighting kept his trade alive, even if the empire itself felt like it teetered on overreach and under. Planning, as he set out toward the Forum, his path took him through the Subura, Rome's dense, noisy lower-class neighborhood. He passed the insulae, tall apartment blocks that leaned precariously, their windows flung open with cloth scraps or laundry fluttering above. Children darted underfoot, shouting about figs and pigeons. One boy offered him a dead rat, grinning. Gaius declined politely and kept walking. His first stop was a small temple of Vesta, a modest structure tucked near the edge of the Forum, where the flame of the goddess was kept burning. Though the state-funded Temple of Vesta in the Roman Forum employed its own sacred virgins and formal rituals, dozens of smaller neighborhood shrines honored her with simpler observances. The priestess, a round-faced woman named Tullia, greeted Gaius with a nod. "You're late," she said. Though not unkindly. "I'm early," Gaius replied, setting the basket down with a soft grunt. "It's the sun that lags today." She smirked and began inspecting the candles. Beeswax, as she had requested. Long tapers, cleanly cut, lightly rolled in powdered rose petals. He had even shaved down the wick ends with a bone knife to avoid fraying. Vesta's flame demanded elegance, even in something as mundane as a candle. As she unwrapped one, the scent of melted wax and faint rose water wafted up between them. Tullia's expression softened. "The senator's wife will be pleased," she muttered. "She's convinced poor quality candles offend the goddess. Some gods are easier to offend than others." Gaius replied, though not too loudly. His next stop was a very different kind of temple. The open-air stall of a self-proclaimed haruspex, or seer, who worked with offal, birds, and candlelight. A fortune-teller of dubious repute, she operated near the Forum's eastern edge, where legal vendors blended with opportunists and thieves. Her name was Rubria, and she wore a necklace of polished goat teeth and clay charms. "You've brought the ones dipped in ash?" she asked, emerging from a curtain of old tunics strung between two poles. Gaius nodded. Lavender oil, as always. Wicks trimmed short for controlled burn. She grinned, revealing a missing incisor. Controlled burn, controlled fate. That's what I always say. She tossed him a small leather pouch filled with bronze coins. The smell of boiled entrails lingered in her tent. Gaius didn't linger. Next, he climbed the Via Sacra toward the heart of the Forum, weaving between marble columns and public statues. Though the grand temples and basilicas loomed tall, their beauty didn't quite reach the street level, where sellers shouted over one another. Dust collected in corners, and raw sewage meandered in shallow stone channels. His last delivery was to a domus, a private home belonging to a wealthy family on the Celian Hill. These orders always made him uneasy, not because of the distance or labor, but because these clients tended to treat candles not as necessity, but as novelty. They wanted fragrance, colored wax, tapered designs. Sometimes they asked for layered marbling, red and white to honor Mars, blue and yellow for Neptune. Gaius did what he could with soot and wine dregs, but the results were often unpredictable. The villa's steward opened the gate before Gaius could knock. "You're dripping," the steward muttered, eyeing the trail of wax flakes on the marble step. "It's wax, not wine," Gaius said, straightening. "And it doesn't stain inside." The atrium was airy, perfumed, and lined with small oil lamps that flickered beside statues of ancestors. Gaius caught a glimpse of the lady of the house, a tall, slender woman with gold hair pulled into impossible coils, briefly inspecting the candles before turning away. He wasn't addressed directly. The steward signed a wax tablet acknowledging receipt, and that was that. Gaius left without a word, his basket now light, but his shoulders sore. He paused near a shaded well, splashed water on his face, and let the coolness soak through his tunic. The afternoon sun pressed down with steady weight, and though he still had errands, he took a detour back through the Forum. He wasn't alone. In his midday pause, near the steps of the Temple of Saturn, two grain merchants argued about shipping delays, while a boy offered honey cakes to passers-by. A disheveled senator's aide mumbled a speech to himself under his breath, pacing as if to imprint it into the paving stones. Then came the interruption, a shout, the heavy clatter of armor. A small group of Praetorian guards approached from the side street, black cloaks catching the wind. They stopped just ahead of Gaius, confronting a stall-keeper selling cheap votive candles near a shrine. "You there," one barked. "Where do these candles come from?" The vendor hesitated, pointing to a half-empty crate. A man in Subura, tall, dark tunic, and what temple were these for? The man stammered, "I sell them to whomever pays." A woman said they were for Juno. "That's all I know," one of the guards reached into a sack and withdrew a candle, short, stubby, clearly tallow-based. But it had collapsed sideways mid-burn, curling into a mess of wax and wick. Gaius's eyes widened slightly. He recognized the poor workmanship that, the guard growled, was lit during a dedication. It went out in minutes. There were whispers of bad omens. "Do you know what happens when senators think omens are bad?" The vendor stammered an apology. Gaius slipped quietly away before the conversation reached him. He had no part in that batch. It was amateur work, clearly, but he knew how quickly blame could spread. Candle making was thankless, and when candles failed, fingers pointed toward whomever was easiest to reach. Back in the Subura, Gaius returned to his workshop. The wax pot still sat over the hearth, its surface cooled to a dull sheen. The molds had been cleaned and stacked. The remaining wicks hung like limp threads, still perfumed faintly with vinegar and salt. He sat on his stool and stared at the amber-flecked candle stubs near the wall. Some returned by clients, others simply left unlit. Each one held a history. Some lit the way to prayers. Others sputtered through arguments or births or sleepless nights. He took one unfinished candle and scraped the bottom with a bone knife. He adjusted the wick. He dipped it once more into the cooling wax smoothing the edges with a damp cloth. The tiny flame it would eventually hold might be used to bless a child, or perhaps to light a cook's corner during a storm. Or it might simply burn unnoticed in the back of a tavern, lighting. Spilled wine and whispered confessions, Gaius didn't know. He didn't need to. What he did know was that a candle, like its maker, might be forgotten, but its light, even briefly, mattered to someone. And yet, one question burned in his mind like a low ember. What happens when your craft is only remembered when it fails? Dusk, wax, memory, and the unseen flame. As the sun began to slip behind the terracotta roofs of Rome, the scent of roasting lentils and charcoal fires drifted through the alleyways. In the Subura, sounds changed with the light. The hammering from blacksmith stalls quieted. Children's voices faded. The chatter in taverns and under archways deepened in pitch, and the faint, rhythmic thump of footsteps echoed in the streets. Like water dripping into a cistern, inside his cramped workshop, Gaius Fulvius Secundus lit the evening fire with a small beeswax stub. The flame caught slowly, licking the kindling with patient orange tongues. Shadows stretched up the stone wall, flickering across his shelves of molds, jars of powdered herbs, and bits of wick tied in rough bundles with string. Even after a full day of deliveries, there was still work to be done. Tonight's task was an order for an upcoming funeral vigil. It was for an elderly scribe who had died of a fever, his passing unnoticed until neighbors realized no smoke had risen from his chimney for 2 days. The vigil would be simple, held in a shared courtyard, with prayers, some figs, and a musician plucking at a lyre. Gaius had been asked to provide the vigil candles, 12 tapers, plain and steady. Burning, he worked slowly, melting the wax in a clay pot over the fire. He dipped each pre-cut wick into the vat, letting it cool between dips, forming layers like rings on a tree. There was no room for decoration tonight. These were candles not for beauty, but for remembrance. His hands moved with practiced ease, but his mind wandered. Once, long ago, he had thought of changing his trade. He had imagined taking over his uncle's book copying stall, or even apprenticing with a mosaic layer. Candle making was tedious, messy. It stained your robes and filled your nostrils with vinegar fumes and animal fat. You could never quite wash it off. And yet he had stayed, because everyone needed light. No matter how forgettable his name was, his work found its way into homes, temples, and tombs outside. A light rain began to fall, spattering softly against the roof tiles. It hissed on the fire for a moment before subsiding. Gaius didn't mind. The rain, it gave the air a clean smell and brought quiet to the alleyways. In the silence, he heard the soft creak of sandals outside, then a knock. He opened the door to find a girl, perhaps 10 years old, soaked through and holding a small wax tablet. She was the niece of Cassia, the old blind basket weaver who lived 4 doors down. "Excuse me," the girl said politely. "My aunt says the light is out again." Gaius nodded. He had repaired the old woman's oil lamp more times than he could count. The wick never quite sat right in the bronze holder, and Cassia's hands, while sharp with straw, were not suited for trimming fire. "Wait here," he said gently, from a shelf. He took one of his plain candles, not even scented, and wrapped it in cloth. He lit a stub from his hearth, handed it to her, and gestured to the wrapped taper. "Give this to her. It should last the evening." The girl took it with wide eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, then vanished back into the damp night. He returned to his bench. In the ancient city of Rome, you rarely saw the stars. Smoke, cloud, and lamplight blurred the sky most nights. But tonight, just for a moment, the clouds parted and a pale gleam of moonlight touched the edges of his workbench. He looked up through the narrow window, watching the silver light stretch toward the shelves of wax and oils. In a city of forums, arches, and marble declarations, his was not the work of history, but it was the work of hours of dusk of silence. As he shaped the last taper, he remembered how his mother had once explained the soul, not as a flame, but as the wax that held it. The wick, she said, was your time. The wax was your life. And the flame was whatever meaning you gave it before the wick burned out. He sat with that thought as he trimmed the final wick. The candle cooled in the basket beside its 11 siblings, waiting for delivery at sunrise. Then came a soft knock again. This time, it was a man in a linen tunic, someone unfamiliar. He looked hesitant, even sheepish, as though unsure he had the right door. In his hand was a broken taper. The wax cracked, its wick burned down awkwardly. The man looked down at the stub, then back at Gaius. "Are you the one who makes the candles?" he asked. Gaius nodded. "I am." The man shuffled. "My wife bought this last week." It burned straight through the meal and kept going. He smiled faintly. "We didn't expect it to last so long." She said, "Maybe it was blessed or something." Gaius shrugged. "It was just wax." "Good beeswax, even so," the man said, and held out a coin. She wanted another. Same type. Gaius didn't take the coin. Instead, he handed the man a candle from the shelf. "Tell her to cut the wick shorter. It will burn steadier." The man took it gently, nodded, and left. Gaius stood in his doorway a moment longer, listening to the rain easing into a soft drizzle. Somewhere far off, a tavern door slammed shut. A dog barked. Then quiet again back inside. He banked the fire, cleaned the wax from his tools with slow circular strokes, and closed the shutter to the street. The day was done. He lit one final candle, a small one, barely the length of his hand, and placed it on the shelf beside his workbench. Its light flickered against the stone, reflecting off the jars and cast small halos on the ceiling above. A quiet flame. An unnoticed flame, but still burning, because in the end, what was a candle really? Not a monument, not a statue, not a name. Carved in stone, just light in the dark flickering. Brief, but warm, and isn't that what most of us are? Thank you for joining us on this quiet journey through the surprisingly busy day of a Roman candle maker. If you found this gentle dive into forgotten history relaxing or sleep-inducing in the best way, please like, share, and subscribe to Quiet Boring Sleep. It helps us keep making calm, thoughtful stories to ease your nights. Until next time, sleep well, and may your candle burn just long enough